A single blade sits behind glass in Cairo, gold handle, a pommel of clear crystal, and a dull gray edge that has not rusted in more than 3,000 years. Most people walk right past it. They crowd around the golden mask a few rooms over, take their photos, and never look twice at the knife in the corner. But a few years ago, a team of scientists pointed a scanner at that gray blade, fired a beam of radiation into the metal, and read back what it was actually made of. The answer stopped them cold. The iron in that blade did not come from any mine on Earth. It fell out of the sky. It came down as a burning rock, and someone, more than 3,000 years ago, found it and shaped it into a weapon fit for a king. That king was Tutankhamun. The blade is his dagger. And this is not a legend or a fringe theory. The scan is published. It is peer-reviewed. It has been repeated. This is not a myth, not a metaphor. The most famous boy in ancient history was buried with a knife forged from a meteorite. Here is where it gets strange. The people who made that blade may have known exactly what it was. Long before telescopes, long before anyone could explain what a shooting star really is, the Egyptians had a specific name for this kind of metal. Translated, it means iron of the sky. Not iron, not metal. Iron of the sky. They were not guessing, they were recording. And the dagger is only the beginning, because that same scan revealed things nobody expected. Because there is another Egyptian object 2,000 years older than the dagger that carries the exact same impossible fingerprint. And because a handful of clay letters written between kings may prove this blade was never Egyptian at all. To understand what was really found, we have to start with the object itself. And the one thing about it that should not be possible. Because once you understand what this blade really is, 3 questions open up underneath it, and each one is bigger than the last. How did a civilization that could not make iron end up with a flawless iron blade? Why did they have a name for this metal that describes an origin they should not have been able to know? And if this dagger was not the only object like it, if there is a whole hidden trail of sky metal running back through Egyptian history, then who has been sitting on top of that trail for 100 years without saying a word? Every answer we find only makes the next question harder. So, let's take them in order, starting with the blade itself. Picture the moment it was discovered. A cramped tomb, sealed for over 30 centuries, opened for the first time. Inside, a boy pharaoh wrapped in layer after layer of linen, and tucked into those wrappings, against the body itself, 2 daggers. One had a blade of gold, the other had a blade of iron. The tomb had first been cracked open in 1922, after years of digging in the Valley of the Kings, when almost everyone had given up on finding anything intact. What came out of it stunned the world. Room after room, packed to the ceiling with treasure. Golden furniture, chariots, statues, jewelry by the thousands. But the daggers were not found right away. They surfaced later, in 1925, when the body itself was finally unwrapped, layer by fragile layer. And there, laid directly against the boy's right thigh, wrapped in close to his skin, was the iron blade, not stored in a chest with the other valuables, held against the body, in the place you put the one thing you cannot afford to lose. To us, iron sounds ordinary, cheap, the metal of nails and fences. But in the world this boy lived in, iron was almost non-existent. There were no iron mines. There were no forges pulling iron from the ground. In that age, iron was so rare that it was worth more than gold. Some estimates put it at roughly 80 times the value of gold. So the truly precious dagger was not the golden one. It was the gray one. And the gray one had barely rusted at all. That last detail is easy to skip past, but it is its own small miracle. Iron does not survive. Left in the ground for a few thousand years, most iron simply eats itself, oxidizing away into flakes and dust until nothing recognizable is left. That is one of the reasons iron objects from this deep in the past are so vanishingly rare. They rot into nothing. But this blade came out of the tomb clean, its edge intact, its surface still readable enough for a scanner to work on it thousands of years later. Partly, that is the bone-dry air of a sealed Egyptian tomb. And partly, it turns out, it is the metal itself, because iron from space carries a chemistry that resists corrosion better than the ordinary kind. The blade survived because of where it was born. For decades, that was treated as a curiosity and little else. The dagger was catalogued, photographed, admired for its craftsmanship, and filed away as a beautiful ceremonial object. The blade is a little over 13 inches long. The gold sheath is worked with delicate feather and lily patterns, and a small jackal head. The handle is gold, studded and finished with that clear crystal pommel. Museums described it as one of the finest examples of ancient metalwork ever found. And that description, while true, quietly skipped over the only question that actually mattered. Where did the iron come from? Because in the century when this boy was alive, Egypt could not make it. The technology to smelt iron out of ordinary rock did not take hold there until roughly 600 or 700 years later. So a rust-free iron blade in a tomb that old is a problem. It is a piece of advanced material sitting centuries before it should exist. That is the first clue. And it was hiding in plain sight the entire time. That is what makes it strange. Now here is what makes it stranger. When scientists finally tested the metal, the first answer they got was wrong. Because testing this object is almost forbidden. It is too precious to cut, too fragile to sample. You cannot melt off a piece to run through a furnace the way you would with an ordinary artifact. So for a long time, nobody knew for certain what the blade was. In 1994, a team tried a non-destructive method, firing X-rays at the surface and reading the light that came back. Every element in the metal glows at its own signature wavelength, so in theory, you can read a blade's recipe without ever touching it. Their result suggested the iron held only a small amount of nickel, under 3%. And on that number, the case was closed. Ordinary iron. Nothing to see. Move on. But that explanation had a problem. Meteoric iron and earth iron are not the same substance, and the thing that separates them is exactly that ingredient, nickel. Iron dug out of the ground on this planet contains almost none of it, typically under 4%. But iron that forms in space, inside asteroids, drifting for billions of years before it falls, is loaded with nickel, often 10 to 30%. Nickel is the fingerprint. It is the one number that tells you whether a piece of iron was born in the earth or born in the sky. And a small handful of researchers were never satisfied that the reading was right. So they went back. And this is where the real answer arrived. A newer team, led by scientists at a technical university in Milan, brought a more sensitive scanner to Cairo. Same idea, X-rays fired into the surface, no damage, no cutting. But far more precise instruments, and this time they read multiple points across the blade. When the numbers came back in 2016, they were not under 3%. The blade held just under 11% nickel. It carried cobalt as well, at levels that lined up with the nickel exactly the way space metal does. They took that composition and compared it against 76 known iron meteorites, cataloged rocks that had been confirmed to fall from space. The dagger did not just fall somewhere inside that range. It landed right in the middle of it. Not at the edge, where you might argue about a fluke. Dead center. If you were handed that chemistry with no label and asked what it was, you would say meteorite without hesitation. The old reading of under 3% nickel had simply been wrong, an artifact of weaker equipment reading a difficult surface. The better machine cut straight through the doubt. There was no longer any serious doubt. The metal in Tutankhamun's dagger was forged from a rock that fell from space. It was space debris, hammered into a blade and slipped against the body of a king. If a discovery like this is why you are here, this is the channel that goes looking for it. Subscribe, because we chase this exact kind of thing every single week. Now hold on to that word from the beginning. Iron of the sky. because this is the moment the story stops being about chemistry and starts being about something far harder to explain. We assume ancient people were superstitious, that they looked up, saw lights in the dark, and invented gods to explain what they could not understand. And there is truth in that. But sometimes, buried inside what looks like superstition, there is a hard, literal, technical fact. And this is one of those times. The Egyptians had a written term for iron. In their language, it reads, in the best translation scholars can give, as iron of the sky, metal of heaven. And for a long time, that was waved off as poetry, the same way we might call gold sunlight, or call a diamond a piece of starlight. Pretty language, nothing more. For decades, scholars treated it as symbolic. Then, modern science scanned the blade, and the poetry turned out to be a lab report. These people were not describing where they wished the metal came from. They were describing where it actually came from. They watched rocks fall out of the sky. They collected the strange gray metal inside those rocks, and they named it for exactly what it was. Iron of the sky. They were not guessing. They were recording. And we spent 100 years reading their record as a fairy tale. And it was not only Egypt. The cultures around them did the same thing. In the land between the rivers, in ancient Mesopotamia, iron carried a name that also translates to metal of heaven. Across the ancient world, wherever this strange gray material appeared, the people who found it reached the same conclusion independently and wrote it into their languages the same way. This was not one culture's poetic flourish. It was a shared, cross-continental observation, recorded again and again by people who had never met, all pointing at the same place. Up to the ancient mind, a substance that fell from the sky, harder and rarer than anything they could dig from the ground, was not a curiosity. It was a gift from above, charged with meaning, reserved for kings and gods, which is exactly why you find it buried against the body of a pharaoh and almost nowhere else. That alone would be remarkable. But the dagger is not the oldest piece of this puzzle, not even close. And the next object is the one that turns a single strange knife into something much larger, a pattern. Long before Tutankhamun, before the pyramids at their peak, before Egypt was even fully Egypt, there was a small burial ground in the north of the country. The site sits about 70 kilometers south of Cairo, and it has given up some of the earliest evidence we have of Egyptian civilization taking shape. In 1911, diggers there opened graves filled with the ordinary and the precious, side by side, an ivory pot, a copper harpoon, bead jewelry of gold, and threaded in among it a string of tiny tube-shaped beads made of gray metal alongside gold and blue lapis and dark red carnelian. 9 little cylinders of iron. They were dated to around 3,200 years before the Common Era. That is not 3,000 years old. That is over 5,000 years old. Roughly 2,000 years older than the Boy King's dagger. They are, as far as we know, some of the oldest worked iron objects on the entire planet. And when researchers finally put one of those beads under a modern scan decades later, they did not just find high nickel, they found something you cannot fake. Inside the metal was a crystal structure known as a Widmanstätten pattern. It is a lattice of interlocking lines that only forms one way. It forms when molten iron cools down over millions of years, incredibly slowly, at a rate that is physically impossible anywhere on Earth. The only place that kind of cooling happens is deep inside an asteroid, floating in space, while the solar system is still young. That pattern is a signature that cannot be forged and cannot be imitated. It is a stamp from space, and it was sitting inside a bead threaded onto a 5,000-year-old necklace. And that finding did not come easily. When those beads were first studied, over a century ago, researchers noticed the high nickel and suspected a cosmic source right away. But in the 1980s, other scholars pushed back hard. They argued the nickel could have come from an accident of early smelting, a fluke of ancient chemistry, and that there was no need to invoke anything falling from the sky. For years, that doubt held, and the beads were quietly downgraded from cosmic marvel to metallurgical accident. It took the modern scan, an electron microscope, and an X-ray tomography machine turned on a single bead held in a British museum to end the argument. The crystal pattern settled it. You cannot smelt that structure into existence by accident. It only forms in space. The doubters were wrong, and the beads were exactly what the first researchers had guessed 100 years earlier. The scan showed something else too. The bead had not been melted. It had been hammered, cold-worked, folded, and beaten into a thin tube by hand, the same way early people worked gold and copper, which makes sense, because you cannot smelt a metal you have no furnace for. But you can pick up a lump of sky iron that has already been forged in space and simply beat it into shape. That is the secret. That is why iron from meteorites shows up thousands of years before iron from the ground. The sky delivered it already finished. So look at what we actually have. A necklace bead over 5,000 years old, made of meteorite iron, cold-hammered by hand. And a royal dagger 2,000 years later, made of meteorite iron, worth more than gold, buried against a pharaoh's body. Two objects separated by 20 centuries, carrying the same impossible fingerprint. Not similar. Not a coincidence. The same. This was never one lucky accident. This was a tradition. For thousands of years, the people of the Nile were collecting metal that fell from the sky, working it by hand, and treating it as the most sacred material they had. A civilization with a quiet, unbroken relationship with fallen stars. And almost nobody talks about it. Here is where it gets stranger still. Because the more closely scientists looked at the dagger, the more they realized it might not have been made in Egypt at all. In 2022, another team ran the blade through an even finer analysis at the museum's own conservation center. They confirmed the space origin again, the nickel near 12%. And this time, they could see the crystal pattern and even tiny dark inclusions in the metal, the kind of internal flaws that only come from a specific class of iron meteorite. They could tell the blade had been shaped at low temperature, worked carefully with heat, kept below the point that would have melted the internal structure away. That is not crude work. Meteorite iron is stubborn and brittle, and if you overheat it, you destroy the very thing that makes it special. Whoever forged this blade understood the material at a level that took the rest of the world centuries to reach. They coaxed it into shape without ever crossing the line that would ruin it. Whoever made this knew exactly what they were doing. But then they looked at the gold handle, and they found the detail that cracked the whole story open. The gemstones on the hilt were glued in place with a plaster made from lime. And lime plaster was not something Egyptian craftsmen used in that era. They used a different material entirely. But there was one place where lime plaster was standard practice at that time, a kingdom to the north, in what is now Turkey, a land called Mitanni at the edge of Anatolia. And Anatolia matters here for a reason that goes far beyond glue, because the people of that region were not new to this craft. They had been forging blades out of fallen meteorites for well over 1,000 years before Tutankhamun was even born. One of the oldest known daggers, made from meteorite iron on Earth, was pulled from the ground at a site in Turkey, dated to more than 2,000 years before the Common Era. While Egypt was still treating sky iron as a handful of sacred beads, the smiths of Anatolia had turned it into a working tradition, shaping the metal into blades with a skill Egypt simply did not have. So, if you are looking for the one place in the ancient world capable of forging a flawless meteorite dagger with a gold hilt, you are not looking at Egypt at all. You are looking north. And that is where a completely different kind of record enters the story. Not stone, not metal, clay. Buried in the ruins of an ancient Egyptian city, archaeologists once recovered an archive of letters written between the great kings of the age. They are known as the Amarna letters, and they are exactly what they sound like. Diplomatic mail between rulers, complaints, gifts, marriages, alliances, all pressed into clay tablets. They are around 3,400 years old, written in the shared diplomatic language of the age, and they read like the private correspondence of the ancient superpowers. And in two of them, sent by the king of Mitanni to an Egyptian pharaoh named Amenhotep III, there is a description of a gift, an iron dagger with a hilt of gold, handed over as part of a royal marriage when the pharaoh took the foreign king's daughter as a bride. In an age when iron was worth more than gold, a foreign king was sending an iron blade south as a wedding present and writing it into the official record so it would never be forgotten. Amenhotep III was Tutankhamun's grandfather. So, the picture that assembles itself is this: a foreign king in Anatolia, in a land that had been forging blades from fallen meteorites for well over 1,000 years already, sends a rare iron dagger with a gold handle to the pharaoh of Egypt as a wedding gift. It passes down through the family. And when the young Tutankhamun is laid to rest, his grandfather's sky metal blade goes into the wrappings with him, an heirloom worth more than gold, its true origin already half legend. The blade behind that glass in Cairo may be a diplomatic gift that fell out of the sky, changed hands between empires, and was buried with the wrong king entirely. But that is where the clean story ends, because the official account of this dagger has never actually settled, and that is the part almost nobody mentions. Think about the trail this object has left. In the early 1970s, one study quietly suggested the blade was meteoric, based on its nickel. That study was never properly published, and the methods were never even recorded. In the 1990s, another test looked at the same blade and concluded the opposite, that it was ordinary iron, and the case went cold for 20 years. Then, the 2016 scan reversed it again, back to space. Then, the 2022 study pushed the origin abroad, to a foreign kingdom. And almost immediately, another set of researchers published a formal challenge to that 2022 work, arguing the scans were not precise enough to prove what they claimed, that the crystal pattern could not truly be read at that resolution. In the same period, a full book was published on the iron objects from the tomb, and its conclusion was blunt. Based on the evidence available, it is currently impossible to reach a reliable answer about where these objects truly came from. So, the most famous blade in the world has been declared earthly, then cosmic, then Egyptian, then foreign, then uncertain again. Not because anyone is hiding the truth, but because the object refuses to give it up. It is too precious to cut open, too sacred to melt down. Every scientist who approaches it is forced to read it from the outside, through the surface, guessing at the heart of the metal without ever touching it. The one thing that would settle the argument for good, cutting into the blade, is the one thing no one will ever be allowed to do. It was tested and contested and tested again, and it still keeps its secret. The answer is locked inside the iron, and the iron is locked behind glass. Now, does any of this prove the wildest version of the story? Does it prove that gods came down from the stars and handed advanced technology to ancient man? No, it does not. And the grounded explanation is not disappointing. It is, if anything, more impressive than the fantasy. Here is what almost certainly happened. Meteorites fall. They always have. Every so often, across thousands of years, a rock streaks down out of the sky and buries itself in the desert, and inside it is metal. Ancient people found those rocks. They noticed the strange gray material would not shatter like stone, that it could be beaten and bent and shaped. They could not make iron. They did not need to. The sky was making it for them and delivering it to their feet. So they gathered it, worked it by hand, and because they watched it arrive from above in fire, they understood something genuinely true about it. It came from the heavens. They wrapped that truth in the language of gods because that was the only language they had for something that fell from the sky and could be worked into a blade. There were no ancient astronauts here. There was something better. There were ordinary, brilliant people paying close attention to their world, drawing a correct conclusion from the evidence in front of them, and writing it down so carefully that 5,000 years later, we could scan the proof and find they were right. But that does not make the discovery ordinary, because it means that a form of metalworking, using material from space, was happening on Earth thousands of years before the Iron Age even began. It means the oldest iron in human hands did not come from human industry. It came from the sky. And if that is true, then it changes how we are supposed to read the ancient world. For generations, we sorted their writing into two piles: science on one side, myth on the other. Real records here, superstitious poetry there. This dagger tears a hole in that wall, because iron of the sky sat in the myth pile for 100 years, dismissed as decoration, until a machine proved it was a literal, accurate, technical description of the metal's origin. Which forces the question that should keep you up at night. How many other ancient phrases have we filed under mythology that are actually records? How many descriptions of fire from heaven, of metal from the gods, of stones that fell burning, are not legends at all, but eyewitness reports written in the only vocabulary those witnesses had? We have been reading their science as their religion, and every so often, a scan comes along and shows us we had it backwards the entire time. There are museums all over the world with gray iron objects in their oldest collections. Beads, blades, amulets, rings, pulled from tombs and graves that predate every furnace on the planet. Most of them have never been scanned. Most of them are sitting in drawers right now, labeled simply as iron, their real origin unread, waiting for someone to point a beam of light at them and ask the question nobody thought to ask. How many of them fell out of the sky? We do not know. Almost no one is looking. The dagger is still there, behind glass, in Cairo. Gold handle catching the light, that clear crystal at the tip, and a gray blade that has not rusted in more than 3,000 years because the metal it is made from spent billions of years in space before it ever touched the ground. It was buried with a boy king. It was mistaken for ordinary iron. It was tested and doubted and tested again. And it is still keeping the last of its secret. Locked inside metal no one is allowed to open, quietly pointing back at the sky it came from. The people who made it told us the truth. In 3 words, we just needed 5,000 years to believe them. If this rewired how you see the ancient world, there is another investigation waiting on screen right now that will do it again. Watch it next.